Did you hear the latest news in our keto and low carb community? This headline: Keto like diet may be associated with a higher risk of heart disease. Before you believe this headline and before you stop your current way of eating, that is low carb nutrition or keto diet, try to consider these 10 considerations first. So we will go through it one by one. And the first thing that we have to know is that this study, in a gist, mainly focused on the increased level of LDL, elevated low density lipoprotein, as a risk factor for cardiovascular events such as stroke, heart attack, and other diseases related to our cardiovascular system. They labeled elevated LDL as bad cholesterol. Knowing that is not yet the first consideration that you should consider, but just have that in mind that this study mainly focuses on higher risk of heart disease solely based on elevated LDL. So the first consideration that we have to think about is that this study is actually not peer reviewed. So this means that the quality of how this was done is still not yet authenticated or confirmed by reputable organizations. Also, their only rationale is just people who are going into keto like diet or low carb nutrition, mainly minimizing their carbohydrate intake, were usually having hypercholesterolemia. But this hypercholesterolemia was not quantified. It is not enough because LDL alone will not predict the direct cardiovascular risk, not considering the other inflammatory markers. The more serious inflammatory markers, which include CAC or coronary artery calcium score. And we have a lot of experiences, our patients and also the ones in our community, signifying that before they did low carb and ketogenic diet, their CAC score is actually higher, which means it has higher risk of developing these atherosclerotic events, including heart attacks and stroke. And the moment they did low carb nutrition and, of course, pair it up with proper way of intermittent fasting, their CAC score is now down to zero. And by guidelines, when the CAC score is zero, then all you need to do is reassure the patient that there's nothing to worry about. So that's number one consideration before believing and stopping your current way of life just because you saw that headline. So number two consideration would be majority of the studies supporting these results are actually funded by companies who also promote or are selling cholesterol lowering drugs. Study like this one, I am showing you the study on a bigger scale so you can see that in conflict of interest, so many of these researchers are also affiliated with drug companies who are selling a lot of lipid lowering drugs such as statins and many more. So we cannot remove the factor that they have conflict of interest when they publish these studies. So that's our consideration number two. What is our consideration number three? If ever you have higher cholesterol, which is sometimes the case, but not all the time among low carbers, because there are also a lot of those who are doing low carb with normal level of cholesterol. But if ever you have higher cholesterol, and of course, together with other good markers of longevity, then you are maybe one of these people who are in this study, a study on more than 6 million people, normal, healthy individuals with higher cholesterol. It actually showed greater longevity. So the higher the cholesterol actually has longer lifespan. And it's not an only individual study, but it is a collection of multiple studies lumped into one, which gave us a result coming from more than 6 million people, with a conclusion that higher cholesterol actually has longer lifespan among normal individuals without risk factors of those seen in the previous study, which already has insulin resistance, already have a lot of markers of inflammation, damaged liver, and other risk of direct cardiovascular diseases. So, for our consideration number four, not all LDL are created equal, and there are bad, but there are also a lot of neutral to good LDL. So, saying that elevated LDL alone can lead into heart attack and those cardiovascular events is simply not the best way to show it, because we have to quantify and qualify what are these LDL. LDL, yes, they raise up when you eat saturated fats, especially the ones from animal fats, but it doesn't mean that they are already bad for you. Again, going back to our consideration number three, which according to this study on 6 million people really showed better longevity, greater longevity with higher LDL components. And yes, they eat a lot of fats coming from meat, and we believe that eating, consuming fats from natural sources are actually the best way. And this is the consideration that they are always looking into the old school idea of what types of cholesterol are in our body. The famous one would be the good cholesterol, which is HDL, and automatically they label LDL, low density lipoprotein, which means it has higher cholesterol component than the protein part. That's why it's lower in density, and already labeled it as bad cholesterol. Triglycerides is the one that we use usually for energy, and it can build up, and it's not good for the triglycerides that's built up, especially when you're on a high carb, not low carb diet, not even fasting, and you have a lot of these triglycerides that are major risk factors in these diseases as well. However, what they miss to show us is that there are other types of cholesterol beyond HDL and LDL. There's actually intermediate density lipoprotein, and there's also very low density lipoprotein, which are the real bad cholesterol, and not just LDL. LDL, when it comes to these sizes, can actually be even further subdivided into seven different sizes. So when it comes to seven different sizes of LDL, the bigger ones are actually the more buoyant ones with bigger sizes of cholesterol in it, whereas the smaller ones or small density lipoprotein, small density LDL, actually are the ones that are dangerous, leading into heart attacks, risk of strokes, and atherosclerosis. And these ones are seen depending on which diet you usually consume. So in studies, they noticed that LDL can have two patterns, pattern A and pattern B. Pattern A usually is seen among low carbers. So those who do intermittent fasting, those who do proper way of doing low carb, their LDL might be the same level or it can be increased, but the more important part, it is a large LDL, less particle kind of LDL. They may both weigh the same, like 90, but the amount of cholesterol particles there is lesser in the buoyant larger LDL. And the significance of this ones, the pattern A LDL is also paired with lower triglycerides, lower VLDL, and higher HDL. So that's the one that we should aim. A higher HDL, a lower triglycerides, and a lower VLDL, regardless of your LDL score, because pattern B, the ones with small LDL, which means it has more particles, it is usually seen with higher amount of triglycerides, higher amount of VLDL, and lower good cholesterol, that is HDL. And the pattern B are highly vulnerable kind of LDL that is prone to oxidation, and oxidized LDL is already known to be a direct risk of inflammation in the body that can lead into atherosclerosis generation. So those are the important things that you should know when it comes to LDL. You shouldn't be afraid right away the moment you saw that LDL is the higher component in your lipid profile, because it shouldn't be the only thing that you should look into. Another better way for you to check if you are on the right track is for you not just to check your LDL, but to check your triglycerides to HDL ratio. So you should aim to have a triglyceride to HDL ratio that is lower than 2 is to 1. So, for example, if your triglycerides is 100, then your HDL should be 50 or greater. Or one way to do it also is when you lower your triglycerides, then your HDL, even if it's not very high, automatically you can have a ratio that is lower than 2 is to 1. So, two things that you can do. You can either lower your triglycerides, or you can make your HDL higher so that you can get a lower than 2 is to 1 ratio. So this one is a better marker than just looking at LDL levels alone. So these things you should consider. These are very important, because if we are only looking at LDL, then we might be missing other important factors in our body. Just like in this study where they put athletes on high carb and low carb diet, so high performing individuals, very physically active, they showed not much significance on the effect. Their body composition, their lean body mass, it's still intact with low carb. But the most important thing here, they saw that when they did the high carb diet, yes, it led into lowered LDL, but eventually it led into triglycerides that are highly elevated. So it elevated their triglycerides. And when we look back in this study, we should lower, because the predictor of atherogenic LDL subclass of pattern B is linked into higher triglycerides ratio, because in low carb, our fifth consideration, LDL are mostly of pattern A and is not oxidized easily, meaning that it doesn't have that higher risk of developing those cardiovascular disease, heart attack right away, just like the headline that we are tackling about right now. So again, the LDL for those low carbers who are consuming less carbohydrate intake is actually of pattern A and is not oxidized easily. So if this study is not saying exactly what are the type of LDL that is elevated, then you don't need to worry, because if you are doing low carb the right way, it might not be the case for you, because with low carb, usually the lower is your other markers of inflammation, which would include triglycerides, VLDL, and other markers of inflammation like insulin, higher insulin level, higher HbA1c, higher ESR, CRP, and many more. So that's our fifth consideration. In low carb, what we see are mostly LDL that are of pattern A and not oxidized easily, or the safer good LDL. So our sixth consideration for this, before you believe that headline, remember that lower LDL does not mean better mortality. It doesn't mean that when you lower your LDL, it is already going to save you. In fact, in this study, wherein they measured the dairy food intake and all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality, they noticed that higher intake of high-fat dairy food and milk was not associated with all-cause or CVD mortality. Neither intake of individual dairy products nor intake of total dairy products was significantly associated with mortality. But before you get excited, it's not all milk. You cannot drink your regular milk on an unlimited bottomless kind of drinking, because the more important here are the dairy products that are actually somewhat lower in carbohydrate content, lower in lactose content. So these are yogurt and natural cheeses. Okay, so those things you can consider taking in if you can accommodate that. But again, as part of our consideration, another would be this low LDL does not equate better mortality, because again, if we can recall, a study on 6 million individuals actually show that higher cholesterol paired with good markers actually seen to have been associated with greater longevity. So those are the things on the 6 things that you consider. Now we are moving on to consideration number 7. Again, it's not LDL that you should be looking at, but instead you should consider remnant cholesterol, because studies show that remnant cholesterol actually predicts cardiovascular disease way better than LDL and ApoB alone in this study done in Johns Hopkins Hospital. And this is the study: remnant cholesterol is a better standalone risk for heart attack and stroke. You should be looking at that. So now, how can we know how much is our remnant cholesterol? So our remnant cholesterol can be computed by just looking at your total cholesterol minus LDL and HDL. So why do we deduct LDL and HDL from the total cholesterol? Again, because they are not bad cholesterol. So the ones that will remain would actually be your VLDL or IDL. So those are the bad cholesterol. Triglycerides is not part of the total cholesterol. This is one of the reasons why we shouldn't be looking at LDL alone, because low LDL, however, with remnant cholesterol of 24 microgram per DL, is still associated with 40 to 50% higher risk of major heart disease or stroke. So it's not about lowering LDL, but it should be lowering the remnant cholesterol. So our goal would be to lower our remnant cholesterol to 15 micrograms. So how can we lower our remnant cholesterol? Actually, you can increase your LDL and HDL, and you will get lower remnant cholesterol profile, and that is better when it comes to predicting the risk of heart attacks. So that is why we shouldn't just be looking at LDL alone, but also remnant cholesterol. Again, remnant cholesterol can be computed by subtracting HDL and LDL from your total cholesterol and your lipid profile. And also, another thing that you can look at would be your triglycerides and your triglycerides to HDL ratio. Okay, so now we can move on our 8 consideration before you believe and be afraid of your low carb way of eating. So this one is about the study itself, and it's actually not real low carb, because the study's low carb definition is liberal at 20 to 30% of carbohydrate, because they compare this one to the typical standard American diet of 50, 55 to 65% of total calories coming from carbohydrates. And since 30% is lower than that, they already labeled it as low carb. But for us, and especially when I do my practice, low carb for me is just only until 10% of calories coming from carbohydrate. You will see other experts going against this one, but their only justification is the fact that it is hard to do or people cannot sustain it. But I tell you, when they have the right motivation, especially when it comes to healing, people can endure so much and can even love the process of doing it. Just like myself, I've been doing this for more than 4 years now, going 5 years of low carb nutrition, and that's basically the rest of majority of my loved ones. Not all, of course, even some who are closest to me are still not able to stick sometimes, but for us who are well motivated and are inspired and are very thankful for discovering this journey, we stick at low carb, less than 10% of calories in a day. So the low carb definition that they have here may actually be not really low carb. So this 20 to 30% of carbohydrate intake from calories from carbohydrate intake in a day may be lower than traditional intake, but it is not enough to induce significant insulin reduction, especially for those people who are already insulin resistant. That's why the subsequent fat burning may also not be the case. So if ever there is truth to the headline that keto-like diet now associated with higher risk of heart disease, this is because they didn't do it right. it's actually wrong to label it keto-like just because it's lower in carbohydrate. For us, I can label it maybe as lower carb, but not real low carb, and all the more not real keto diet. So that is why make sure that when you do your low carb, it is the right way and sticking into less than 10% of your calorie intake in a day coming from carbohydrates. So what are the carbohydrates that you need to avoid? So you can avoid the refined carbohydrates, table sugar, all of those sweets. For the natural sugar, even if they're natural, still you have to limit them, okay? Because too much fructose, too much lactose can still be converted into glucose and fructose in your system. That can either increase your glucose level in the body or increase your insulin resistance because of its inflammatory effect. So complex carbohydrates, the ones that you can accommodate, only those that are very high in fiber but low in net carbohydrates. So what is net carbohydrates? It's just the total carbs minus the fiber equals net carbohydrates. So say for example, if the item is 37 grams in total carbohydrates and it has 4 grams of dietary fiber, so the total sugar here is 12, but that is insignificant. What you need to know is 37 minus dietary fiber of 4, then you have a total net carbs of 33 grams. And that 33 grams, 12 of which is coming from simple sugar, but 21 of which are coming from usually either starch or disaccharides, complex carbohydrates. So that's why you have to limit them. And of course, this one is an important feature for you to consider because liberal low carb is, for me, just advisable for those who are perfectly healthy, maybe growing children, maybe healthy pregnant women, but not the ones who are still healing, or else you will not be able to experience the healing from insulin sensitivity, the reversal of insulin resistance that is becoming insulin sensitive, and that can only be attained from a moderate or very low carb diet. So that is a low carb nutrition of not beyond 50 grams a day. So that is why low carb definition of that study showing poor prognosis when it comes to cardiovascular outcome is actually not real low carb. It is a very liberal kind of low carb and it's already very high for us. So that one is not the case. So if you are practicing low carb, lowered carbohydrate with less than 10% of your calorie intake coming from carbohydrate, then this result might not be applicable to you. So no need to be scared and go back to your high carb eating spree. So now we will move on to our consideration number 9. And not all low carbers are actually on keto levels of fat intake. So what does this mean? Again, for our way of eating, there's moderate or general low carb, but ketogenic diet will make sure that your carbohydrate intake is less than 20 grams per day, but it's not the only difference. The major difference of keto and general low carb diet is actually on the fat intake. So a true ketogenic diet will recommend a fat intake of calories coming from fats of about 70%, whereas for a low carb diet, it's only around 40 to 50%, and the other calories will be coming from proteins. So not everyone is actually advised for ketogenic diet. So for those people who already have a lot of fat build up in their body, then you might actually not benefit so much from keto diet, especially if you are consuming the full calories of your body weight, because this time your body will not be able to burn the fats from your body and will just use the fats from what you are eating. So your healing, your lowered inflammation might take a while as compared to those who will be utilizing or using their own body fats in order for it to be converted into energy. In general, I do not recommend ketogenic diet for everyone. There's just indications for those with, say, for example, intractable epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, certain types of cancers and tumors, and certain types of chronic kidney diseases. So it can be medically prescribed for certain conditions, but may not be fit for all. So maybe if ever there is truth to this headline of increased CVD risk because of elevated cholesterol from keto-like diet associated with higher heart disease, it could be these people who are not ideal candidates for keto diet. Maybe they still have a lot of fats in their system that they can use, that they can utilize, but it was not touched, was not burned into energy because they've eaten too much fats from their diet, which is most likely not directly advised by their low carb or keto educated physician, because not all physicians are educated when it comes to keto or low carb nutrition. So now we are moving on to our last but not the least, and this is consideration number 10. The type of fat intake is very, very important because these people might be consuming low carb, like real low carb, like maybe 10% of their calories coming from carbohydrate. But we don't know what kind of fats they are eating, because as much as the amount is important, what is more important is actually the kind or the type of fats that they are consuming. So, what are the good and bad fats that there is? So, we have this one, types of good and bad fats. So, number one, you have to consider the good fats are the ones that are naturally created in nature, naturally occurring in nature. So, instantly bad fats are the ones that's in packaging, the ones that are already altered by chemistry or by whatever factory processing there is. So the most common bad fats that can be found in many kitchen nowadays would be soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, trans fat, practically all seed oils, hydrogenated oils, which are still trans fats, and partially hydrogenated oils, cottonseed oil, margarines. Those are still hydrogenated oils or bad fats. And what can you consume instead? Good thing we have good fats. So we have avocado, we have olive oil, nuts, seeds, eggs, coconut oil, especially the ones that are organic, wild caught fish. So you'll have a lot of good omega 3, extra virgin olive oil. And of course, if you choose meat, choose grass fed meat and grass fed dairy. So those are the types of fats that you can consume, and try to avoid the ones in donuts, the ones in french fries, the ones in chips. All of those are actually processed fats that are going to lead into inflammation, because our last but most important consideration would be the type of fats. So if you know these good fats and you've been avoiding all of these bad fats, so this headline might not be applicable to you, because if ever there is truth to this one, it could be that those participants may not be aware or may not be following a clean kind of low carb, a clean kind of ketogenic diet, even if it's medically advised for them, because they are choosing the wrong kind of fats. Say, for example, margarine is 0 calorie, but it is 100% fully inflammatory. So, those are the things that you should consider. So, now, since we already know all of these considerations, what's our takeaway for this way of eating, for our way of eating? Should we do low carb still? Should we do ketogenic diet still? So these are my top three takeaway for this discussion. And number one takeaway would be, when you do low carb, try to do it regularly. So I know not everyone can stick to low carb 365 days all year round, but when you do, I hope you do it more often than not. So do clean low carb regularly. And if ever you were going to keto proportions, only do it with the right indication. That is why it's good if you can coordinate or have a discussion with your low carb practitioner, with your trusted low carb doctors, to know if you have the indication to do keto the right way. And number two, of course, choose your fat sources well, because it's not just the amount of fats that you are taking, but most importantly, it's also the type of fats that you are consuming. So avoid processed fats as much as you can. And lastly, our third takeaway is, Listen to your body. Usually, when we treat patient, we don't treat the laboratory results only. We look at our patient and ask them how do they feel. Try to ask yourself, because if I ask myself, I've never felt this better. Did low carb, I am at my best. I feel like I am at my healthiest. I no longer have inflammatory attacks, common colds, common flu. I no longer have my previous allergic rhinitis and many other signs of inflammation the moment I started doing low carb and fasting nutrition. However, if you don't know how to listen to your body, you don't know if you still have those aches and pains, then you can ask help from your neighborhood laboratory. So when you do, try to aim to lower your triglycerides, your VLDL, also remnant cholesterol, and of course HbA1c. If you can get your insulin levels, that's even better. And you can also check the other inflammatory markers, which would include ESR, CRP, and liver enzymes. So those things are the ones that you consider. And if ever you want to really lower your cholesterol because you're still afraid, despite all of these, that when you do it the right way, if ever your cholesterol might be elevated, it should be on a background of non-inflammatory state, therefore not a high risk for cardiovascular event. Should you still want to lower it down, maybe somewhat on the normal side, safer side, then you can consider consuming more on the healthy fats that are less saturated, because if you still have a lot of LDL in your bodies, then those are energy that you can use up. You can now start doing some exercise. Hopefully, you do resistance training, the ones that are for muscle bulking, not just on cardio. You can do cardio, but you can combine it with resistance training. So, endurance kind of exercises. So, weightlifting is the best way to go. And also, you can increase foods that are rich in omega 3. So, to balance out the omega 6 that may be in the meat and in dairy. So make sure that you consume organic grass fed kind of meat, because they have the higher proportions of omega 3 to omega 6. And of course, know your low carb levels. If you still need some healing, then you might need to make sure that your carbohydrate intake is no more than 50 grams, and you should choose your carbohydrate sources right away. If you are on the perfect state of health, and maybe you can be at level 1 or 2, accommodating some of those in our caution list, but generally you should be sticking in our safe list all the time when you can. For more guidance, we have this JGC Rojo food list. So you can download this in our website at jgrtanmd.com. So we have this food list on the foods that you can eat almost unlimited basis, and the ones that you should take in caution and you should also avoid. So if I'll be asked if I will still continue low carb nutrition, then my answer, yes, of course, because the proper healthy way of doing low carb only aims to lower insulin, lower inflammation, lower oxidized LDL, increase the fat burning, and eventually decrease the fat buildup, including actually erroneous protein buildup, leading to tumor formation and even blockade in our eyesight and in our brains, leading to Alzheimer's disease. So, yes, I will still continue to do low carb nutrition despite the new study saying that keto like diet may be associated with higher risk of heart disease, because I don't believe that when you do low carb the right way, it will lead into this. It's only when you do it the wrong way, just like that, keto like, but not really the real keto, not really the real low carb, and yes, it may be associated with higher risk of heart disease. That's why it is important for you to learn low carb the best way, the right way. Should you want to learn more, we have a structured learning program at lcfmasterclass.com. However, it's still in Filipino. Soon it will be available in international English version. And for general guidelines, if you wish to be assessed on your current way of eating, how it can be improved or how it can be converted into low carb without you adjusting so much on what you eat, We can do a telemed booking or appointment for me to assess your current way of eating, and I can reply to you your advice or your recommendation on alterations on how you do your day, how you do your meals, on how to possibly improve it. It's available in www.jgrtanmd.com. So I hope those things you will already consider before believing this headline that keto diet shouldn't be followed by everyone. It should be medically prescribed, yes, and it should be done the right way. So these are our considerations. Number one, number two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8, 9, and 10. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for always watching. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you. I hope you like this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channels and, of course, in our Facebook channels. Remember to stay low carb so that we all stay safe. This is your Diet Doctora, Dr. Josephine Grace Rohatan. Till our next video. Bye!